Joe Rogan has aimed his criticism at Barack Obama, arguing the former president ultimately damaged his own legacy. When Obama first ran for the White House, he leaned heavily on identity politics and energized large portions of the country. That strategy proved powerful at the time. Kamala Harris later attempted to reuse the same approach, but it failed to gain traction. Rogan claims that failure traces directly back to Obama's influence. He lays out his reasoning using clips he says support his argument. Joe Rogan reflected on a time when he accepted Barack Obama's words at face value during the lead-up to the elections, noting that he was hardly alone. Rogan argues that more than half of the country followed that same path, setting aside skepticism. Many people, he says, absorbed the repeated claims that Donald Trump was a fascist, a racist, even a white supremacist. Those labels were pushed so consistently, and from so many directions that they began to feel like established truth rather than political rhetoric. According to Rogan, the objective was simple: shape public perception of Trump before voters had the chance to form their own views. Once that narrative took hold, questioning it became unacceptable, and anyone who did was quickly grouped into the same category. In hindsight, Rogan calls it a wake-up call, showing how easily public opinion can be shaped when authority figures speak with confidence, and the media echoes them without challenge. Rogan now argues that very few people accept that narrative anymore, and that eroding trust played a major role in why voters began drifting toward Trump. After years of constant accusations and dramatic warnings, many started to notice a pattern. Rogan says the same extreme claims kept reappearing, yet for many voters, real-world events never seemed to match the dire predictions. What once sounded convincing gradually began to feel staged. Rogan believes much of what was said about Trump was less an honest assessment and more a political strategy designed to influence public emotion and protect power for figures like Obama and later Kamala Harris. Over time, voters grew skeptical, then resistant, and eventually openly defiant. He frames last year's election as a final pushback, arguing that many voters rejected fear-driven messaging rather than responding to it. According to Rogan, the election marked a turning point for many Americans. He believes voters increasingly dismissed fear-based narratives, media conformity, and political spin, reacting not just to individual candidates, but to a deeper loss of trust in the stories they felt were being sold to them. Rogan says Kamala Harris and the Democratic National Committee are still reeling from the scale of their defeat in last year's election. He argues that lingering embarrassment helps explain why some party leaders continue to struggle with the outcome and what it revealed about voter attitudes. Losing is painful, he notes, but losing decisively can be especially sobering. Still, discomfort doesn't change reality. facts remain facts whether they're acknowledged or not. Rogan suggests that accepting a clear loss is often the first real step toward rebuilding credibility and preparing for a genuine comeback. That process requires reflection, accountability, and above all, honesty. Problems can't be fixed if they're never admitted. Until the Democratic National Committee openly examines where it fell short, why its message failed, and why voters turned away, Rogan believes it risks repeating the same mistakes. In his view, political recovery doesn't begin with denial, but with humility, self-awareness, and a willingness to change course instead of shifting blame. Rogan then shifted his focus to Kamala Harris for attempting to take credit for the so-called no tax on tips policy. He argued that anyone paying even minimal attention to politics knows the idea, at least in its modern and widely publicized form, originated with President Trump. Rogan said it was never a core Democratic position, but rather a campaign message Trump introduced deliberately and used effectively, especially with working-class voters. In his view, Harris attempted to rewrite that history, assuming voters would overlook the change. Rogan saw it as another example of political narrative manipulation, one that ultimately failed. The public wasn't convinced, and the election results reflected that. What frustrated Rogan most, however, was that this kind of behavior continued even after the loss. Rogan argues that even after the defeat, Harris continued trying to take credit for ideas and policies that were never hers in the first place. He doesn't view that as confidence, but as denial, refusal to confront political reality. Rogan suggests that most campaigns would draw the line at claiming ownership of policies they didn't create, but he says Harris and her team did not. He also claims they attempted to reshape the narrative around his podcast, promoting the idea that he refused to interview her. Rogan points to the widely publicized push for Kamala Harris to appear on his show, followed by the interview never happening. The explanation offered at the time was unusually convenient, that Rogan had taken a personal day on the exact date the interview was scheduled. That story spread quickly and was largely accepted as fact. Rogan now says it was untrue, arguing that instead of acknowledging the interview fell apart on her side, the campaign opted for misdirection. It's difficult, Rogan suggests, not to wonder whether Kamala Harris was hesitant to confront his platform directly. Joe Rogan is not known for scripted or soft questioning, and he rarely stays within any one comfort zone. His interviews are long, unscripted, and unpredictable, exactly the kind of environment where vague talking points tend to fall apart quickly. That stands in sharp contrast to the now widely discussed 60 Minutes interview, where the network was reportedly accused of editing Harris's responses to make them sound more polished and coherent, a move that raised plenty of eyebrows. Rogan would offer no such buffer. There would be no edits, no revisions, and no producers cleaning things up afterward. It would simply be Harris, a microphone, and real-time follow-up questions. That, Rogan argues, is the real risk. His audience values authenticity above all else, and rehearsed lines can't be hidden behind for hours on end. If a message can't survive an open, unscripted conversation, then perhaps the problem isn't the interviewer, but the substance of the message itself. It seems Harris' team simply didn't believe she could handle a 3-hour, free-flowing conversation with Joe Rogan. Instead, they pushed for a tightly controlled 45-minute interview. This was no mystery situation. They knew exactly how Rogan's show works. His podcast routinely runs close to 3 hours per guest, with no scripts, no teleprompters, and no easy exits. Despite that well-known format, her team reportedly insisted on firm restrictions, not just on time but also on location. They wanted a setting they could oversee, manage, and carefully control. That detail alone says a great deal. Rogan's platform is built around authenticity, long-form dialogue, and unscripted exchange, and reducing it to 45 minutes undermines the entire purpose. When a candidate can't sustain open conversation without guardrails, voters notice. If that doesn't reveal something fundamental about Harris, her confidence, preparation, or reliance on handlers, it's hard to see what would. I would have loved to hear Kamala Harris respond, if Joe Rogan had pressed her on why the border situation was allowed to get so out of control. That conversation alone would have been must-watch material. Rogan wouldn't have accepted buzzwords or carefully polished deflections. He would have pressed for specifics, timelines, decisions, and accountability, and that is exactly where the discussion would have grown uncomfortable. Harris was widely seen as the official point person on the border, tasked with managing the crisis, and critics argue that under her watch, millions of migrants crossed amid what they viewed as weak enforcement and inadequate screening. That reality drew criticism not just from conservatives, but also from independents and Democrats in border states. A Rogan interview would have forced her to address those outcomes in real time, with no edits, no scripted talking points, and no studio polish, just direct questions and long-form answers. That is why many believe the interview never happened. When voters hear raw, unscripted explanations, excuses often fall apart and accountability becomes unavoidable. Ultimately, Harris's efforts to claim policies, control narratives, and avoid unscripted scrutiny revealed more than she likely intended. From taking credit for Trump-era ideas to avoiding Rogan platform, image management often appeared to take precedence over transparency. Voters noticed, holding leaders accountable for both words and actions, demanding honesty over spin. And that brings us to the end of today's video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.